Why did America ban this superfood with 3 times more protein than potatoes? It's a provocative question. It sounds like the setup to a conspiracy. A nutrient-dense native tuber disappears from dinner plates and grocery aisles, while industrial crops and corporate interests rise. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways more revealing. There was no single modern law that outlawed this plant nationwide. But there are documented moments, policies, and economic choices that together explain how a once central, high-protein food became marginalized, forgotten, and, in parts, actively excluded from landscapes where it once flourished. The plant at the center of this story is Apios americana, commonly called groundnut or groundnut. Look closely and you'll see why a chance to resurrect it feels urgent. The tubers grow in chains like strings of beads. Each one is small, brown-skinned, and sweet-nutty when cooked. Botanically, it is a perennial vine, with lacy leaves and fragrant pea-like flowers that climb hedgerows and riverbanks across much of eastern North America. It fixes nitrogen into the soil, produces both edible seeds and nutritionally dense tubers, and survives winters to sprout again year after year. On a dry weight basis, its tubers can contain roughly 16 to 17% protein, about 3 times the protein content of a potato, dried to the same basis. Its beans can be richer still, in the neighborhood of 25 to 30% protein. Long before European contact, Apios was not a footnote. Archaeological digs reveal cultivated Apios tubers and seed remains at indigenous sites across what is now the eastern United States. It featured in managed gardens, sometimes alongside corn, beans, and squash, the integrated polycultures that sustained communities and replenished soils. Indigenous cultivators selected for traits, planted in deliberate places, and used fire, harvest rhythms, and landscape management to shape abundance. This was not passive foraging, it was agricultural knowledge. European colonists learned from indigenous neighbors. There are recorded moments where groundnut literally saved lives. When colonists at Port Royal and groups at Plymouth faced lean years, Apios appears in accounts as a supplemental food, a protein-rich tuber that could be gathered along rivers and in tidal marsh edges. In 1621, while the familiar First Thanksgiving scene centers on corn and wildfowl, historical records suggest tubers like Apios were part of the broader food web that sustained both native and colonial people. These early interactions were practical exchanges of survival knowledge, until law and property began to rearrange who could gather where. Here the story takes a sharp turn. In the mid-17th century, English colonial towns began passing ordinances to codify land claims and control resources. One documented example, a 1654 town ordinance, criminalized indigenous harvesting on land claimed as English. In practice, this could mean public punishments, stocks, fines, or worse, for people who gathered food on terrain the colonists asserted as theirs. That ordinance did not ban Apios across a continent. It was, however, a clear instance of a legal regime that made indigenous access to traditional foodways a punishable act. When laws like this are replicated across multiple settlements, when enclosure replaces shared stewardship, traditional cultivation systems are undermined. That legal moment marks more than a line in a record book. It signals a broader pattern. As colonists established permanent farms and declared property boundaries, communal and managed gardens that had supported native communities were cut off. Foods associated with those gardens picked up new meanings. Groundnut increasingly became labeled in settler culture as Indian food, an association that carried stigma. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, as industrial agriculture evolved, crops that fit European-style annual field systems that could be planted by seed and harvested by machine, and that supported resale and seed markets rose to dominance. The European potato, an annual tuberized crop that suited monoculture and mechanized harvests, became widely adopted, and groundnut slid toward the margins. The 19th century offers another illustrative turn. Europeans evaluating North American plants sometimes tried Apios and dismissed it as messy or inconvenient compared to established staples. Those assessments often reflected cultural preferences and the economic logic of the time. Preference for crops that could be standardized, stored, and marketed at scale. By the time large-scale industrial agriculture took hold, crops that fit a system designed around seeds, annual planting, and centralized processing had clear advantages. Perennials, which regrow and do not require yearly seed purchases, challenge the emerging commercial model. The 20th century brought a surprising and ultimately instructive revival attempt. In the 1980s, a team at Louisiana State University undertook a serious domestication effort for Apios. Researchers, including Dr. William Blackman and collaborators, collected hundreds of wild plants. Records show collections on the order of a couple hundred individual specimens at one point, and crossed and evaluated thousands of hybrid lines. Laboratory notebooks and project summaries from that era report development of more than 2,200 hybrid lines and evaluation of promising selections. One cultivar that drew attention was identified as LA85034, which in trials delivered encouraging yields. In some experimental plots, individual plants produced up to 3.3 pounds of tubers. For a plant that until then had mostly been wild or garden scattered, these findings suggested real agronomic potential. Yet the program didn't reach commercialization. Funding priorities shifted. Key scientists retired or were reassigned, and the institutional momentum dissipated before promising lines were broadly released. Some germplasm survived in institutional collections and in the hands of dedicated seed savers. But the LSU program's abrupt end highlights a structural problem: that scientific research depends on sustained funding, and that institutional incentives do not always align with long-term trials of crops that challenge commodity paradigms. Part of that misalignment is tangible in Apios's biology. It's a perennial that resprouts, so it competes poorly with a model of agriculture built around annual seed sales, hybrid seed royalties, and mechanized single-harvest systems. Because it can be propagated vegetatively and selected locally, it resists the patent and seed sales model that underwrites many modern crop investments. It also has harvest challenges. Tubers are small and connected in chains, making mechanized digging and centralized processing harder than with uniform potatoes. Where a crop is classed as a weed, modern herbicide regimes can eliminate it from field margins and roadsides. Add in commodity subsidies that favor corn and soy production, and the systemic barriers stack up. A nutritious, nitrogen-fixing perennial suddenly has few institutional allies. Outside North America, the trajectory diverged. Japan adopted and domesticated Apios on a commercial scale. There it's known as Hodo or Apios, and it has been brought into agricultural and culinary life in ways that created markets for the tuber. Cultural techniques, culinary preferences, and market support converged to make it visible in ways it was not in the United States. That contrast is instructive. Plant potential is not purely botanical. It is shaped by cultural attention, market structures, and institutional choices. What about the nutrition claims? Apios's tubers present a striking profile on paper. Measured on a dry weight basis, the tuber's protein content of about 16 to 17% stands in contrast to potatoes, which fall near 5 to 6% in dry protein. The bean form of Apios can be even richer in protein, approaching the mid-20s to 30s by percentage. The plant also contains phytochemicals, including isoflavone compounds related to those found in legumes. Laboratory work and animal studies have associated some Apios extracts with modest effects on blood pressure and blood glucose in animal models. These are promising early signals, but they are precisely that: animal studies and lab assays that suggest pathways worth investigating. They are not the same as clinical evidence in humans. There are also safety considerations. Raw Apios tubers contain protease inhibitors, compounds that can cause digestive upset if eaten without cooking. Cooking denatures these inhibitors and makes the tubers safe and palatable for most people. There are documented instances of allergic cross-reactivity for people with legume or peanut sensitivities, so caution is warranted for those populations. The scientific framing here is important. Research suggests nutritional value and potential functional benefits. Animal studies point toward physiological effects, and traditional culinary practices, thorough cooking, remain a core safety measure. Returning to history and policy, how do we answer the title's provocative charge? Did America ban this superfood? The short answer: no single modern federal edict outlawed Apios nationwide, but the plant was subjected to legal, social, and economic pressures that functionally removed it from common use. The 1654 ordinance that criminalized indigenous harvesting on land claimed by English settlers is a stark example of how law was used to redefine who could access food resources. That law was local and contextual. It belonged to a specific jurisdiction and a specific era, but similar patterns of dispossession were widespread. Beyond explicit laws, there were systemic processes that amounted to a de facto suppression: classification as a weed, removal by herbicide in modern farm systems, lack of patenting profit opportunities, and institutional choices to prioritize commodity breeding over perennial domesticates. When public research institutions pivot away from long-term crop development for perennials, and when markets and subsidies favor annual grain economies, a plant like Apios is marginalized by default. At the same time, the narrative is not one of total loss or one-dimensional victimhood. Indigenous communities showed and continue to show agency, cultivating, managing, and preserving varieties. Gardeners and seed savers have kept Apios in backyards, experimental farms, and regional seed networks. Researchers like Dr. Stephen Cannon at Iowa State contributed to germplasm collections that saved genetic diversity. People such as seed stewards and permaculture growers, people like Nat Bradford in contemporary seed-saving stories, have worked to maintain living stocks, exchange tubers, and test cultivation methods. Those grassroots networks create pathways for revival that are not dependent on corporate seed models. What would broader adoption look like in practical terms? Apios grows well in USDA hardiness zones, roughly from 3 to 10. It tolerates part shade, but flowers and tuberizes best with adequate light and moist, well-drained soils. As a nitrogen-fixing legume, it can improve soil fertility, making it attractive to agroecological designs. Harvest is typically done with hand tools or careful digging to avoid destroying tuber chains. Mechanical harvest presents challenges because the tubers are small and irregular. Gardeners are advised never to eat raw tubers and to introduce them into the diet in small portions to gauge tolerance. Starting plants can be established from tuber pieces or by planting seeds, but the latter can require more effort to domesticate for uniformity. For those interested in trying Apios, experimental farms and seed networks, public repositories and dedicated growers are the most reliable sources of material. Beyond horticulture, the broader lesson concerns the way societies value foods. When agricultural policy privileges short-term marketability, annual planting cycles, and patented genetics, perennial crops that support local resilience and food sovereignty can be sidelined even when they offer ecological and nutritional benefits. The story of Apios is therefore a case study in how legal frameworks, cultural stigmas, funding priorities, and market incentives together shape the foods we eat. So why did America ban this superfood? It didn't, not in the sense of a single, countrywide legal prohibition, but a combination of colonial laws that restricted indigenous access to land and resources, cultural stigma that rebranded native crops as undesirable, the rise of an industrial agricultural system favoring annual patentable crops, and the withdrawal of scientific attention and funding effectively suppressed Apios from mainstream agriculture. In some places, it was actively removed as an unwanted plant. In others, it simply faded from the menu, living on in gardens and in pockets of cultural memory. If there's a hopeful coda, it's that the same structural forces that pushed Apios to the margins can be nudged the other way. Community seed networks, permaculture farms, and a renewed institutional interest in perennial crops can recover genetic lines and reintroduce them into diets. International examples, Japan's integration of Apios into markets and kitchens, show that cultural and economic contexts matter. Research groups with sustained funding can finish domestication work, refine cultivars like LA85034 into stable, regionally adapted varieties, and develop harvest techniques that make perennial tubers more viable at scale. This is not a quick fix or a single hero story. It's a call to rethink priorities, to value foods that support soil health and local sovereignty, to fund long-term trials of perennial crops, and to protect and partner with indigenous knowledge holders who stewarded these plants for generations. The question in the title is effective because it forces us to look at the choices behind disappearance, choices that were legal, economic, and cultural. If this history matters to you and you want more deep dives into forgotten foods, indigenous agriculture, and how policy shapes our plate, subscribe and stay with us for the next episode where we trace another resilient crop back through time and into contemporary practice. For now, whether you're a gardener, a chef, a researcher, or simply curious, consider that a nutritious plant grew at the edge of many American fields, and that recovering it is partly a matter of remembering how to grow, cook, and value it again. Look to local seed networks, experimental farms, and community growers if you want to try Apios. Always cook the tubers, start with small portions, and check for legume allergy precautions. This is not a miracle cure, but it is a living piece of a larger puzzle. What foods we cultivate, who gets to gather them, and which crops reflect the future of resilient, just food systems. Share this story to help surface the plants and practices our food systems have pushed aside. Links in the description will lead to seed networks, research archives, and groups working to preserve Apios and other perennial food plants. Together, remembering and replanting can change what's possible at the dinner table.